Thank you so much for allowing me to share my research. This is exciting for me. This study was aimed to understand the lived experiences of organizational leaders in crisis decision-making, looking at the impact on their physical, their mental, and their emotional health. We integrated 3 concepts: critical thinking, situational awareness, and agility. And this will provide insight and use for future business leaders. So this study utilized 2 conceptual frameworks to help us understand crisis decision-making. And the first was VUCA. Are any of you familiar with that term? That's been around since the 90s. The military used it quite a bit. It's actually part of their history. And it looks at how volatile a situation is, how uncertain it is, how complex it is, and how ambiguous it is. By the year 2010, organizations had started to look at this and bring this in because, as was pointed out, we've been in crisis and we're going to be in crisis. And so organizations wanted to understand the impact on the performance and also the leadership capabilities. The second framework that we looked at was a biological, psychological, and social model. And this looked at, when we talk about biological, we know what that means. That includes genetics. But when we talk about psychological, that's more than just your mental process. That's your thought patterns. That's your emotions. That's how you perceive. That's how you interpret. And all of that influences your behavior. And when we look at social, we're looking at within a workplace, we're looking at the external environment. Do you have good relationships in your workplace? Do you have a support system in your workplace? Are resources available? So these 2 models were what we based the study on. Then we looked at the business impact, and I chose 2 industries to look at, and one was healthcare, because healthcare has been in a state of crisis, and the second was power. And I thought, these are 2 industries that we can't live without, for sure. And what the study showed is that VUCA it requires a shift in your leadership, a paradigm. We used to be more transactional in our leadership, and we would tell you this is what you need to do. And what we have found in a crisis situation, we need to be more transformational. The continual communication was required, as was decision making. It was done on a continual basis. And you had to scan the environment, look at what's going on inside the organization, what's going on outside the organization, and just as importantly, what's going on with your stakeholders. Because during the COVID crisis in the United States, stakeholders had a lot to say about the decisions that need to be made. When we looked at the BPS model, it recognized that when employees and leaders, when they were healthy, when they felt their well-being, it improved job productivity, job satisfaction, retention, employee engagement, and well-being. Basically, what the study looked at is how human performance is impacted in crisis, because it is. And it's impacted on an individual level, it's impacted on an organizational level, and it's impacted on a team level. And all of those suffer from the impact. When employees suffer, business suffers. It's influenced by the different factors. One of those factors are the psychological things that we discussed, and then the leadership style that a leader has, the organizational culture and the norms within the organization. And during crisis, people get into an overload situation. And when they do, they make a lot of mistakes and they make a lot of errors. And what I've seen influence that a lot is tunnel vision. They become so hyper-focused on what their goal is, or they're looking for that confirmation bias. They're looking for someone to confirm, this is what I think, right? And then there's always groupthink. And in a crisis situation, leaders, there's a heavy workload, there's an unusual time pressure involved. It's a different environment, and it impacts the synergy of the organization. With VUCA, we learned that people had to learn new skills and new competencies. And that's hard to do when your organization is in the middle of a crisis and you're trying to tell your people they have to relearn technology. They have to use new technology. People don't understand why, and maybe they don't want to do it. And what they needed was strong leaders to support them and guide them and give them resources. We recognize with the BPS model, in a crisis, everybody's stress goes up. Everybody's anxiety goes up. And this impacts how you do your job in every aspect. And before we went in, and for the states, COVID was probably the biggest crisis. And I'll talk more about this later, I had 4 of my participants that had suffered through that in a variety of businesses. But it is, you don't have time to make a decision. The decision-making criticality refers to the degree of importance and the urgency in a decision that it has in each context. The higher the risk, the higher the more options you need to consider, the higher the time pressure, the higher you've got to have more information. And when information is limited and that occurs in that uncertainty, it's either you've got too much, you don't have enough, or you've got misinformation. For the purpose of this study, critical thinking was defined as reasoning thinking with purpose, and it was acknowledged that critical thinking reduces standard errors or biases. One of my favorite books that Daniel Kahneman wrote in 2011 was Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And it looked at how the brain thinks and makes decisions. And he identified System 1 thinking and System 2 thinking. System 1 thinking is where we all go. It's our familiar thoughts. It's where we're comfortable. And that's usually where we make our decisions with our gut. That's where we're familiar. System 2 thinking allows us to step back and to look for different options and to look for alternatives that are out there. And when you're utilizing System 2 thinking, then decision-making is intertwined with critical thinking. It brings out more problem solving, more reasoning, and that provides a different perspective. So the lessons that I learned from the research, the first has to do with agility. And when I first started doing research, all the research talked about adaptability. And it took me, I'm like, okay, we do have to be adaptable. But adaptability is different from agility. You've got to be agile. You've got to be able to innovate. You've got to be able to move quickly and to come up with different perspectives instead of adapting to the situation. And you've got to be censoring and monitoring the whole time. And that's not just looking at what's going on in your organization, that's looking at what's going on externally in your industry. And you've also got to, every research study talked about communication. And I boiled it down to one, and that is the 5 basic communication tools. 1 is tell everybody that has a need to know the information. 2 is to communicate clearly, concisely, and frequently. 3 is choose candor over charisma. Be honest with your communications. 4 is focus on the positive. Focus on what you can control. And 5 is calm the chaos down with your communication. Be sure that the message you're sending is understood within the organization. Different studies looked at different behavioral strategies. Mindfulness has come into play, but so has selflessness and compassion. But I had a big population in my study was military. And when you're on the battleground, when you're getting ready to storm, you don't have time. I think I'll take a moment and be mindful. It doesn't work that way. But what you can do, and what a couple people reported to me that they did do, is they grounded themselves. And I was surprised to hear a senior Marine say he connected to the Schumann wave of the earth. And that grounded him. And then he focused on his breathing. He took a big, deep breath, got that breath down into his diaphragm and exhaled. Because he recognized when you change your breath rate, you change your heart rate. And when you change your heart rate and your breath rate, you create heart rate variability and that gives you a feeling of wellness. And resilience is more than, being strong. It's building your psychological capital. And that's how you're thinking, that's your thought processes. And it's what you're feeling and how you're building your self-efficacy. How my research was conducted, I chose the interpretive phenomenological analysis, and I chose that primarily because it recognized that individuals all have unique perspectives, and it's very subjective as how they interpret those perspectives. The data was collected using semi-structured interviews. I had 19 participants in my study. Data saturation occurred at 16, so I capped it there. I used the semi-structured interview as a tool that I used. And if the study had one limitation, it was perhaps the interview was 1 hour. I often wondered if my participants had long enough to reflect during the interview, but I tried to use member checking continually to be sure that I understood what they were saying. Of course, there was a thematic analysis, open coding, and the data analysis was rigorous, but this really helped me to understand the individualized perception and what the leaders were feeling and what they were experiencing, because they all came from different backgrounds. And it didn't matter whether you're a Marine, you're a 5-star Army general, you're a Fortune 500 corporation leader, you're a former NFL football player. Everybody has a different perspective. And I wanted to understand that and capture that. So I had 3 research questions, and they focused on critical thinking, situational analysis, and agility. And the questions were, what are the lived experiences of organizational leaders utilizing critical thinking with crisis decision-making in a VUCA business environment? And the second applied to situational awareness. How did the organizational leaders apply situational awareness in a VUCA business environment? And the third was agility. How did they relate to agility in that situation? There were 3 reoccurring themes that came from the study, and the first had to do with teamwork. And I mentioned that a large part of my population was in the military, and teamwork is fundamental. It's such a big part of logistics, but it's also such a big part of the live or die. And I had several people tell me that, if your team's not with you, that impacts your ability to live or to die. I mentioned the the Fortune 500 executive, and she was put in charge of a team because they had received a big customer, and there was not a team in place to service this customer. And the team wasn't recognized as a team. The roles weren't defined. They didn't know what they were supposed to be doing. The Fortune 500 customer didn't know how to interact with them. And the team came to her and said, we want to disband. We don't see any reason for us to be in place. Senior management came to her and said, you better figure out a way to make it work. She shared how she used communication and agility to build the trust within the team, and she turned that team into a top producing team. The need to understand decision-making constraints. 20% of my population had gone through COVID, and that was a crisis that they cited. And they were all in very different businesses, but either not enough information, too much information they got on a state level was different than information they got on a federal level. And a lot of them, the information said you have to close your business because of the nature of your business. A couple of them, you have to close your business because they didn't have staff. The staff wouldn't come in. So it affected everybody differently. But, it affects business differently too. And I mentioned that former NFL football player. And he said, let me tell you about decision-making constraints. You're in a championship game. You got the quarterback, and he's demanding field precision. Then you got the coaches on the sidelines, and they're strategizing on what you should be doing. Then you look up, and you've got the owners, in the box, and they're looking down, and they're looking at your image, they're thinking about your marketability. Then you've got the fans on the sidelines, and you can tell they're all critiquing you on social media, and you're the player on the field, standing there trying to make a decision. And you know that the decision that you make will influence the trust of all your team players. And I thought, that really is very applicable to a business environment, because you've got your internal, your external, you've got your stakeholders, you've got so many people analyzing what you do and how to do it. The third was the importance of communication strategy. And communication is a part of every organization and a part of every team. One of the best examples, though, and the most different examples I heard, was communication. I felt so blessed. I had a 5-star Army general, and you want to hear the best part? It was a female. And she shared how complex, communication is within the military, because there's different layers that are of hierarchy within there, and it's very complicated. So basically, in the military, you're told what you need to know, when you need to know, when your superior says you can be told. And that can be a very frustrating situation. The emerging themes, and of course the emerging themes relate to the BPS model. The emerging themes were mental health. All 16 participants talked about how their being in a crisis impacted their mental health. 3 of them mentioned fear, that fear got in the way of their critical thinking. Several of them mentioned the negative thoughts in my head. I just had to focus on what was right and what I could control, and that was hard to do. And with emotions, it's important. You have to recognize and be aware of the emotions that you're feeling and how those emotions factor into your situational awareness, because it does. And then physical health, the body keeps score. Everything that's going on in here, the body keeps score up. 2 of the participants reported as a result of the crisis they were in, one had a heart attack and one actually came down with cancer. So in doing this study, in chapter 2, for all of you that have done a dissertation, you recognize, the extensive review. And I looked at leadership styles, I looked at leadership theories, and the question that I asked was, what were the leadership principles or criteria that guided your decision? And a lot of people talked about transformational servant leadership, but it came down to inclusive leadership is critical. And that means you have to understand and value the diverse perspectives. And they have to be heard and respected. And that starts with management training. Managers need to be trained to understand what emotional intelligence is, how to communicate, what neurodiversity is, how do you communicate with those that process information differently, and agility. And Dr. Wright, you pointed out the importance of collaboration with everybody. You can't just look internally. Look at your stakeholders and how can you leverage their insights and how can you use those resources. And the most important thing is communication with two flows. Just me talking to you isn't the same as me talking to you and you giving me feedback that I can use in my decision-making process. The study implications, I looked at 5 levels. The most important for today is to talk about the individual and the organization, though we looked at family, society, and political. But on an individual and organizational level, agility, being able to innovate, but within ethical frameworks, situational awareness, and a lot of them use people analytics that we have available today within our systems. And then the third was critical thinking, and that includes strong problem skills and being creative. And diversity. We live in a world that we've got to recognize the importance of diversity. The study results, the positive social change that it created around the recognition that mental health impacts the decision-making process. The recommendations for practice are the leadership development within this decision-making world And that's just understanding the need to use your emotional intelligence. It's not just the old decision tree that we used to make. We've got to be able to factor many more aspects in. Inclusive leadership practices, and that means including at all levels throughout the organization, and building that resilience in the workplace, making resources available to the people that need them, providing social support. And for me, the biggest takeaway is the acknowledgement of mental health and that how it influences an organization's performance. Because the World Health Organization states that by the year 2030, the largest global disability will be brain-related diseases. 12 million days are lost each year from anxiety and depression. And that equals $1 trillion lost in productivity. So the biggest takeaway is the impact that mental health has on organizations. Thank you for being with me today. And I think it's important to recognize that the challenges, perceive those challenges as opportunities. That gives you the potential to learn and to grow. Keep building your cognitive and your emotional skills, because that builds your brain capital.